Meet me at the Chazen. I'm your host, Gianofer Fields. The following episode is a recording of a live panel discussion held in the Chazen Museum of Art in November of 2022. The discussion was entitled Monuments Reimagined, Contemporary Artists as Changemakers. The topic, how can we re-memorialize our shared past? It was my pleasure to host a conversation about the role of contemporary artists in disrupting the narrative of public art, forging new paths, and understanding the role it plays, if any, in community identity.
Good morning, everyone. Sorry, I didn't mean to start. I startled you. My name is Candy Waterloo, and I'm head of education here at the Chazen. I want to thank you for joining us in this space. And before we begin the program, we're going to start with what we do at the top of every program and read the land acknowledgement here at the university. The University of Wisconsin-Madison occupies ancestral Ho-Chunk land, a place their nation has called Dejop since time immemorial. In an 1832 treaty, the Ho-Chunk were forced to cede this territory. Decades of ethnic cleansing followed when both the federal and state government repeatedly but unsuccessfully sought to forcibly remove the Ho-Chunk from Wisconsin. This history of colonization informs our shared future of collaboration and innovation. Today, UW-Madison respects the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk Nation, along with 11 other First Nations of Wisconsin. Today's panel, Monuments Reimagined, a Contemporary Artists as Changemakers, is moderated by Chazen storyteller in residence, Gianofer Fields. I could spend, Gianofer. Gianofer and our esteemed panelists will contend with questions about how we can re-memorialize our shared past in ways that disrupt the status quo. I could spend the entire hour listing the credentials and achievements of our guests. I won't do that because I know we want to get to what will be a robust discussion. So I'm just going to go from far to close to me. So joining us is Director of Partnerships at Monument Lab, Naima Murphy Salcido. Sitting next to Naima is contemporary artist Sanford Biggers. Next, we have independent curatorial consultant Marilu Knode. And last but not least, Chazen Family Distinguished Chair in Art and Professor here at UW-Madison, Faisal Abdu'Allah. All right, Gianofer, take it away.
Okay, hello, my name is Gianofer Fields, but you already know that. So what I'm going to do is that I really wanted to focus this conversation on what is a monument and how that creates a space and how it creates place for community. But we're currently reading this book, How the Word is Passed by Clint Smith, and there's a paragraph in here that I want to start off with. And I timed myself. It takes me 3 seconds to read a line, so this should be 26 seconds. Take out your stopwatches if you dare. And it's as follows. New Orleans is my home. It is where I was born and raised. It is part of me in ways I continue to discover. But I came to realize that I knew relatively little about my hometown's relationship to the centuries of bondage rooted in the city's soft earth, in the statues I had walked past daily, the names and streets I had lived on, the schools I had attended, and the buildings that had once been nothing more to me than remnants of colonial architecture. It was all right in front of me, even when I didn't know to look for it. And I think that's one of the key elements of what a monument is. But I'd like to start this conversation by asking you, Naima, what is a monument? How do we define monuments?
Yeah, no, thank you. So a lot that question is something that pops up all the time. And I think in our work at Monument Lab, what we know for sure is that there isn't one definition of monument. We've taken it upon ourselves to define a monument as a statement of power and presence in public. And that's how we kind of move through our own partnerships and relationships to really reimagine what it means to be in public space and be represented. In one of our recent projects, a national monument audit, we had to define a monument in order to count and in order to create a data set. And we found that despite our own thinking and what many others think that sometimes there's an office somewhere like that is keeping tabs on all the monuments, making sure their upkeep is there, all that stuff. It's actually most often being tracked by property records. And so another kind of demonstration of that power in place of who owns this place and cares enough for, certain monuments to stay erected. So I guess that's a little nebulous, but for me and for the organization, it's really like that statement of power and presence.
So Faisal and Sanford, as artists who place monuments, talk to me about the considerations of what you're thinking about when you're placing an object there. Is it the space that determines it? Is it the material? Is it the emotion? Is it the emotion or the message? How do you start to think about monumental work when as you're creating and conceptualizing? And either one of you.
I'll just quickly add, good morning. I just think from my standpoint, I think there's a sacred connection between memory and imagination. And that's the premise at which I start to insert myself into thinking about an object in public space. And I think that if the memory is jaded or ill-informed, then the imagination can't function. So that's basically my kind of piece.
And Sanford, how do you approach that?
Well, first I try to determine if I am actually making a monument. Working monumentally versus making a monument are different things. And I take in consideration, obviously, the history of where the piece might be going, recent history, older history, and the demographic that it may be serving, and then what kind of statement I might be wanting to make with those considerations in mind. So again, I've done pieces that I think memorialize things, but their scale actually has been diminutive. I've done pieces that are, monumental, but I was very emphatic in saying that this is a contemporary artwork for people to come and put their ideas and their discussion to. It's not commemorating anything that's been here in the past. In fact, it's trying to open up a future dialogue. But this is a case-by-case thing. There might be an opportunity or a situation where literally I would be replacing a monument, and then my considerations might change. But so far, that's how it's been.
Yeah, and I think that opening up is really important because, I considered, Blueprint almost like a porthole, that it's not a grandiose piece about me. It's more about coming to the work and understanding why the piece has come into existence, because it's talking about far more complex issues. Something as simple as sitting in a chair, a barber chair, or sitting in a hairdresser's chair, and understanding how transformative that is for a human being, and how you're able to occupy another space by being the best version of yourself through the laying on of hands. And in some ways, the hairstylist or the barber is doing a form of sculpting, doing a form of refashioning.
And it's also extraordinarily intimate. You just don't let anybody touch your head, because it really does sort of determine how you move through the world. And in terms of how monumental works are in the world, Marilu, talk to me about placement. What are you considering when you think about placing a monument in a space?
I think that really depends on what your opportunities are in sort of where you're working. So, for example, I worked for many years at Alamar Sculpture Park in St. Louis, and what was really great about that was we controlled 105 acres, so we could sort of put things where we wanted. But our goal was to do works under the rubric archaeology of place. So that no matter what we did in the suburban landscape was to reinscribe a sense of place for people who don't really understand what landscape is. And so within the park, we have to figure out where is this going to be seen from a distance. Things really change when you're outside. You can really change scale. If we can take a Bernard Williams car made of plywood and it makes Alexander Lieberman's huge piece look small as a result, that's where you're really playing with space and sort of conflating how it is that you relate to things. So when I worked for Sculpture Milwaukee, however, when you work in an urban environment, you have a whole different set of things to really contend with. And it's not just skateboarders. It's really about the size and shape of the buildings around you. And it's actually sort of, what does this financial district mean? What does it mean for the city? What does it mean for the people who live here? And how can we empower people to feel that they belong there too? So scale and color has a lot to do with it for sure. We put a Tony Tassett blob monster in front of the federal building, partially because there's nothing on the corner, because the feds don't like you to put crap on their corner. But it was a big, right? No bubbler bikes, but it was a big monster going like this. The kids loved it. And somebody said to me, "But isn't this like a sort of a political statement too?" Like, oh, I don't know what you're talking about. Of course, it's a political statement because everything's a political statement, right? So there's got to be some sort of context. So if you have a big, ugly building behind you, then you have to figure out how do you counter a big, ugly building. If it's a beautiful, exquisite building from, the 30s and it's Art Deco, then you put a Gare Ammer next to it. So it really, it's being very sensitive to space. I come as from a position of a curator, but to support artists. Always the work that I do is in support of artists. What best makes their work look fantastic? But where's that critical commentary?
Mm-hmm. For me, that was really a major consideration when doing the piece at Rockefeller Center, the Oracle. So it ended up being, a monolithic, black, very curvaceous figure amongst very tall, rigid, gray buildings in, arguably one of the most, the busiest intersections and a symbol of commerce and the grandiosity of New York City. Mm-hmm. And there's already so many references to Greco-Roman history and mythology that I wanted to create something that potentially could create new myths. So I wanted it to function. It wasn't a passive piece, but it was one that engaged all the viewers, but it also changed. It worked really within the landscape. And I'm pretty sure you feel the same way about this, but that's part of the challenge and the fun of doing something at that scale is literally saying, how am I composing this within an urban or, a suburban environment? And how does that environment affect the work? Then how does the work go back and affect the environment?
And also, I think the conversation between the community and the work,
mm-hmm.
like how does that come in? Because I know you talk about putting like elements and symbols in your work, and you talk about monumental versus monument. Talk to me or talk to us about how that conversations with the community, where this piece will be placed, sort of comes into play.
I mean, I always think it's important to not necessarily parachute ideas into communities. And I think having some kind of shared history, some kind of platform for a shared history. And it was a beautiful moment that took place was I got a photograph sent to me by Christina, the director of Momoka. And what happened was somebody had set up outside of the Chazen, cutting hair on a public street, literally 6 feet from my piece. And then they went out and they said, "Oh, why are you doing this?" And he says he performed with public haircuts for people who maybe are homeless. And they said to him, "Have you seen that piece next to you?" And he was like, "No." And then he looked, and then he recognized the contours on the chair, So obviously that is a very kind of familiar, iconic Belmont barber chair. So he immediately recognized it. And then this thing went wild on Instagram. So people began to understand that there was a familiar form that they could necessarily connect with historically. And they would talk about their parents taking them to the shop. So there was this really interesting conversation taking place once people saw there was a recognized form. And also the way in which the piece was augmented through Quora, because I said I wanted the base to be almost unfinished. And as you move through or elevate through the piece, there were certain finishes that I wanted. So we got in Martin Foote, who finished the hands and the head, which was a very important component for the piece. And in some ways, it's a metaphor for who we are as human beings, because limestone, as Jim would say, comes out of the ground hard and comes out of the ground soft and hardens over time. And they always say human beings, in some ways, they harden as they get older. Mm-hmm. And I would hope that they don't embrace that part of the stone, but they embrace the reverse of it. So I want them to soften as they kind of meet the work.
And how does a reflective quality play in your work, Sanford, that you have up?
So yes, unfortunately I don't have an image of it, but you can look online. There is a new monumental scale piece in Orange County, at the Orange County Museum, called Of Many Waters. And it is made with a two-tone stainless steel surface that has many discs. So some are black and some are reflective, and they blow in the wind. So when you see it from a distance, it looks like a large three-dimensional sculpture. The closer you get, you realize it's actually a flat facade that is animated by the wind, moving these small little sequins, if you will, from side to side. That, once again, very site specific. This is in California. I'm originally from Los Angeles, and I was thinking about image, Hollywood, things that look full and robust, but they're often stage fronts and, and so on, and the duplicity of that. So on the back side of this piece, it actually looks like a large quilt. And in fact, I painted it to look like an anamorphic drawing. So if you're looking at it from the central axis, it looks like a perfectly symmetrical quilt. But when you deviate from that vantage point, it starts to fall apart. So once again, it was a lot about illusion, composition, reflection. Do you see yourself in this piece? The piece is almost bacchanalian, so it's really laid back. It's also in front of a huge Richard Serra that is just tall and erect in front of it. And so I wanted this figure to be some bacchanalian laying on its side. So it created a different sort of landscape.
So Naima, as we talk about new pieces that are monuments and monumental, how is that changing the landscape of what we're seeing in terms of these large works in public places?
I mean, I think even what we've heard already, I think that contemporary artists bring a sense of, that desire of folks to interact with their work, or a knowledge that folks will interact with their work in public. And so there's a very clear sense of that. I find, like, in terms of how the monument landscape changes, I mean, the work that we do is both looking ahead at what a monument landscape could be in this country if we told more stories that represented the society we're part of, and then also reckoning with what we've inherited. And so, and part of that reckoning certainly includes, recognizing the kind of toxicity and the harm that a lot of monuments that stand have. And it's also, part of the reckoning is also acknowledging how folks have worked to reclaim those spaces, whether it's through protest, to remove those monuments, whether it's how they've transformed those monuments with projection, or how the plinths stand on their own and become something brand new. And I think that there's a connection there, both in reckoning with what we have and a vision looking ahead, that I think is really, I'm proud to be a small part of, working with artists and kind of prototype monument opportunities, but also seeing across the country and really world with artists who are saying, these curvatures, these experiences, they relate to so many people who see their work or see their experiences, blown to monumental scale. And then start to look around their environment a little bit more closely, because they realize, like, that paragraph that you read, Gianofer, like, I think that I relate to that so much, because you could either be ambivalent to what's around you because it doesn't feel like it's for you, or as you start to see more objects that are monumental sculpture or public works that really are speaking to you, you start to be able to claim more space in public as well, and kind of claim that power that, we have as individuals.
And I wonder, does a monument then have a lifespan? Is it the history of the community that determines the lifespan of the monument, or the people who are currently there? Who decides on the lifespan of a monument?
I think about this a lot, even when working at a more interior scale. I think a good work of art has the ability to shapeshift over time. There are moments when that same artwork could be in favor and out of favor as culture evolves around it. So in that sense, when we finish a work, it's not necessarily static, doesn't exist in a vacuum. It actually does evolve as culture evolves, or devolve as culture devolves. So, it's a long game. You don't know exactly how it's going to wind up. What I think is interesting, particularly about a lot of the protests regarding monuments and memorializations, is that we've seen so many different things happen. We've seen them be defaced. We've seen the projections. We've seen them removed. We've seen them put underwater. And people are like, what do you think about each of those things? I'm like, I think that is the process itself. We're seeing several different examples of how people are reacting to it. I don't think I prefer some other than, other actions, but I think all of them are important for us to start to figure out, how do we contend with this, with these histories.
And I want to just jump in and say, so to your question, that so much of what we're talking about today is an evolution away from the 1% laws that were really public process, and these are much more curated activities. And that's partially to get away from the plop art phenomenon of the 60s and 70s, where you commission something for the side of a very ugly corner in a city and it's plop art and it's not that attractive. So I think the fact that we recognize the fact that public art by artists is such a critical way for us to think about the world that we live in, that there's been some sort of, bringing that back into more high-level artistic realm. But I did want to bring up a piece that is in response specifically to the protests in Madison in 2020 at the state capitol, so that the protesters, everybody here's from Madison probably, what happened. They took down Forward, which was a young, idealized woman representing the state, and then Christian Haig, a Norwegian immigrant who actually who led the Wisconsin contingent during the Civil War, right? So he was for the North. But a lot of the young people, circulating around the Capitol were really angry that there was nobody there who represented them. And so Michael Johnson, head of Boys and Girls Clubs of Dane County, talked to the governor, and the governor set up the Val Phillips Task Force. And so I'm working with Radcliffe Bailey, the artist, to memorialize Val Phillips, probably the most important female, politician, Black woman to be represented, who represents so many different ways of change in the state of Wisconsin. And so there's bipartisan support for this piece to go on the state capitol, which is, in my mind, unheard of, that there's anything bipartisan in the state of Wisconsin right now. And the fact is that they did the public process very differently. They first got bipartisan support, and then they went to approach Radcliffe just to make sure it would go up. Mm-hmm. So we'll wait and see what happens next week. We're assuming the piece is still going to go up. But that once we pass those sort of barriers, the conversation with Radcliffe has been, he gave us two maquettes. One, Val standing like this with her arm out, sort of reaching out like that. And another, Val sitting in a chair, very, very beautiful minimalist chair based on a photograph. And at first the group was really interested in the standing piece, but does that just mimic the way that we memorialize men now? It's like if it's not a guy on a horse, it's a guy going like this. And so we thought a lot about it. Val Phillips is sitting this beautiful, elegant, very attentive posture that she has in the seated piece. And we realized, in fact, that's a different way of exercising power. Val Phillips represents a new form of power in our state. And so we've all agreed that that's the piece that we want to see on the state capitol. So it'll be Forward, idealized woman, Haig, and then Val Phillips. And she will be the first woman of color so honored in any state capitol in the country. So Wisconsin is really doing something to respond to the protests of 2020. And I think that's a really exciting thing for the state.
I think that brings up another issue of partnerships, like creating partnerships. Talk to me, anyone, about the space between conceiving the idea and then finding partnerships and ways to make it come to fruition. It's a beautiful, we're working on a Emancipation project here at the Chazen, and so the Mass Consortium has been here since Tuesday, and I've been bugging Sanford since Tuesday. And to see what goes on behind the scenes is, to me, mind-blowing. Because, you walk by a sculpture like, oh, somebody put it there. You watch a documentary, you're like, oh, somebody put it there. No, it's Akachi running all over the place and taking off his shoes and climbing on things to get all these shots and things. And so it's all this all this activity in the background. So talk to me about, when you think of an idea, what are those steps? How do you form those partnerships? How do you get that ball rolling?
I mean, I think for me, when I first conceived of Blueprint, it was thinking about, why don't we start to have a conversation with these monuments? Because removing them, actually, there's only one beneficiary, the person who's removing them. And I think that even when they remove them, they move them to a park somewhere. Somebody gets paid to move them there. Then somebody else gets paid to pick them up and move them back to another museum. So even when they take the piece and melt it down, they will still say, that was General Lee's ear, or that was his foot. So the name and the monument still lives on, even if it's physically not there. So I was, keen to think about creating something, some kind of form, based off a class I did with my students. I gave them this empty plinth and I said, what would your ideal piece be? And I was speaking to the curator at the time, Leah Kolb, and she said, maybe we can make it out of styrofoam. Maybe we can, if you want to make this large thing, we can speak to Cora Stone. And so I went to see Cora. And they were like, yeah, we can do this thing in styrofoam. But at the same time, Jim and Heather, they were looking at how black hair can be replicated in stone. And they heard that I was a barber. And they said, oh, we're kind of fascinated by the fact that you're a barber. You actually understand hair. Maybe we could think about doing something in stone. And there was a series of conversations backwards and forwards. And I'll never forget, we went for a walk in the yard, me, Jim, and Heather. And he was pointing at like the marble and Bianco P, these different kinds of stone. And then I realized that different stones speak back to you differently. That the marble and the granite, there was no negotiations. And then he mentioned limestone. He said, if you look at limestone, you see all these kind of marks and these imperfections. And that was the thing, that's when the penny dropped, that this thing had to be made out of limestone, simply because of the way it was constructed. And then he mentioned about it being, coming out of the ground soft and hardens over time. And then backwards and forwards with the different people in inquiry. I mean, Heather is an artist. So Heather would converse with me all the time about what do you want this piece to be? And then having to translate that to all the crafts people there. And then watching this thing come out of the ground and go on this machine. It was just an amazing collaboration, and watching this arm that carves the piece for 80 hours. And you just watch this block, and eventually you see your head, your shoulder, your foot. But for me, the most moment of enlightenment was flying Martin Foot in the master carver to finish the hands and the head. But why that was important to me, because it was a similar format when I'm a barber. Because I use the machine to create the flat top or the Bobby Brown or whatever it is they want. And then I finish it with the razor. So it's almost like the razor that I use, the cutthroat, was the metaphor for Martin Foot. And the machine was the robot that does the 80 hours. So for me, that was a wonderful arc of learning for me and collaboration and knowing what it means where different crafts, persons, insert themselves into the work. And I always say the blueprint is not my piece, it's our piece. That's how I look at it.
Sanford, that sounds like Wednesday morning. Talk to me about that experience, because how long was the conversation about hair? And Jim learned a very important lesson. You don't ask the black woman if you can touch her hair. So talk to me about that conversation that you done Wednesday morning.
So yeah, very similarly, we were discussing how would you depict very specifically the hair of Frederick Douglass. And those of you who are familiar with him, there's lots of documentation, there's lots of photographs of him, because he really believed as soon as the technology was there to make images of black people that we needed to embrace it quickly so we could portray ourselves rather than be portrayed by others. So he was a huge advocate of that. And throughout the years, you see his hair go through different phases of textures, basically. And so our conversation was about that. And the thing that struck me as funny is that anybody who's ever done any type of reimagination or depiction of Frederick Douglass has had to talk about the hair. Because the hair is such a signature aspect of his persona, right? So yes, we had a conversation. We were looking at samples that were already done in stone. And we're like, well, let me go through my phone book right now and see who I know who might have hair like his, so we can take some pictures and we can figure that out, because we know that that is an aspect that we really want to pay some attention to. Because Mark and I have seen several iterations of Frederick Douglass, and we're like, the hair on that one is not as good as the hair on this one, but the face on this one seems different than this one. And once again, we're comparing that to pictures of his different ages. So it became so specific that we're even to the conversation now of talking to a woman who works in Hollywood and does hair for film and theater and so on. So she's worked with several types, and she creates hair and wigs and so on. So she really has a hands-on idea of multiple textures as well. Just as you would, just by cutting hair, you have a different understanding of the various densities and coarseness and curls and so on. So we're trying to figure that out right now. Yeah.
It was fascinating, too, to see that, because as you're talking, how each piece of the ideal is broken down, and how, as a person who approaches a monument on the street, I see the whole thing. Again, I don't think about what it takes to get it there. I don't think about how it got there. I may show up for the actual moving of it to get some sound, because that's always cool sound when trucks are around and things are grinding and growling. But that behind the scenes of what actually it takes to get there. But Naima and Marilu, you also have some behind the scenes work that you have to do in order to get a monument where it needs to be, or a piece where it needs to be, and also to understand where they are and why they're there.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I think as a team, Monument Lab is interesting to me because we have so many different backgrounds. Like I come from an arts administration background. We have researchers on our team. We have artists on our team. We have historians on our team. And I think that's like a microcosm of the folks that are impacted by this work. I think that how collaborative it is really like reflective of, the vested interest we all have in what happens in public. And so, the inclusion of researchers, for example, is why like really most of our projects have a central research question that artists can respond to, that publics can interpret. Whether it's, I think one of the projects right now that we're working on is what is a story that is missing in public? And so it's always a question we don't know the answer to, that we want to hear answers to, and get an understanding of how folks will interact with work, and also that artists can bring those or their own answer to life in a major way. And so all of those pieces really inform our work and how we document it, so that because our projects are not always long lasting, making sure that there is documentation so that there is proof that we were here, that these artists' voices were heard, that these people's interpretations are acknowledged. And so that takes so many different types of folks, right? Sometimes we're working with city governments. Sometimes we're working with community activists. Sometimes we're working with, the third grade class, so really being able to kind of appreciate all the knowledge and real desire to be seen that comes from all of those folks. It's so important to have that collaborative spirit.
And I would say too that there are. I used to say with Sculpture Milwaukee, there was like for every one of me, there'd be another 100 people, right? So there's the artist, the dealer, the crater, the shipper, the crane operator, the people that block off the street for the crane. You have to figure out if the sidewalk's hollow and you're all going to collapse the city. There are all these other sort of considerations to think about, but. I came from a more traditional museum background, and then working in the public realm for the last, almost 2 decades. One of the biggest, I think, challenges for public art programs is, if you go into a museum, you've already self-selected. You're there to see the art. You know who you are. You have an idea of what you're going to see. Public art, the problem is, how do you actually track any sort of impact the artist might have on the public? So if you drive your car by fast and your eyeball glances something, is that engagement? Mm-hmm. And so the word, when I hear people say engage, we want the public to engage, I don't want you to climb on the work, because it just damages it for the most part, not exclusively. And so the work at actually sort of talking to your audience is so critical. When it's about public art, you want to explain what you're doing. You want to put it in context for the things around you. And I find that really very exciting. So when I was in St. Louis, we would partner with people all across the community. We started a program called Loans That Don't Move, so that we could actually insinuate ourselves into the Missouri History Museum, who had like a giant tugboat in their collection. We would do all these kind of crazy things simply to sort of expand our audience and to sort of create this feedback loop. But I think education is really one of the hardest things when you're actually, trying to engage people in public art. What was here before, if anything, and how does this relate to your life? And I think that's the thing that's most interesting to me.
An aside, but related, when we did the Oracle project at Rockefeller Center, a lot of people don't realize this, but we had an interactive element to that, which was basically a QR code that if you scanned, it would lead you to a site, and a few times, maybe once a week or so, was sort of random timed, you could consult the Oracle. And the Oracle was voiced by Michelle Ndegeocello, fantastic musician. And oracles typically in the past, in antiquity, were actually women. And they would speak in, basically profound and enigmatic phrases that people would have to figure out the meaning for themselves. So you could go online and you can ask Michelle questions and she would respond to you. So that was one way that we were trying to not only track some of the viewership, but also allow people who weren't in New York City to engage with the piece, so that once again it was sort of an active relationship, not a passive relationship with the work. And also thinking about the behind the scenes, it was amazing to be on Fifth Avenue at 2 in the morning, where they blocked off the street. All the lights were purple. There was a mist, and then a flatbed truck came with 3 huge pieces, and they erected this whole thing, with cranes and everything. And then somebody went inside, where there's a ladder, and had to bolt and weld from inside, and then crawl out from beneath under basically a stage. So there's a lot of coordination, choreography to get these things done, and could be hundreds of people involved with any type of installation of this scale.
So Sanford, both you and Faisal work in multimedia. Talk to me, what determines how you create the piece? Is it the idea? Is it the placement of the piece? Is it the lifespan of the piece? At what point does the material come in of what you're going to do to create these pieces?
I think for me, whether it's a piece in the public sphere or a piece that's in the sacrosanct space, it's always, charged from the idea. And for me, then the idea needs to sit in a particular kind of vessel or form. So, inside Momoka, I've got a gold-plated 24-karat Koch barber chair. And people are thinking, well, why have you got a solitary barber chair inside the space? Again, I'm speaking bodily about what it was like as a 5-year-old kid going to these, barber shops in people's homes in the 70s. And that being my first university of learning. So I'm sitting there, I'm 6 years old, and my father said, you're seen, you're not heard. So I'm observing, I'm watching everybody in the room, listening to all their little exploits. And my dad says, block your ears. And I have my Black Panther comic and my sketchbook, and I'm drawing. So for me, that moment and that space of experiential learning and how important that was, and the preciousness of that, and how I was able to transition as a young person in 1970s England, had to be represented in some kind of artifact that was magical and talismanic in a way. And that's how the piece came into existence. And I apply the same kind of approach, whatever it is I want to make,
Same for me. It's really the idea happens first, and then it's a process of translating that into a material that I think speaks to the idea. And then you deal with some of the practical issues. How is this going to live? How long can it be outside? What is this installation? Is it 2 months? Is it 2 years? And then that starts to, be introduced into the conversation. But for the most part, for me, at least working outside, I have like a palette of 5 or 6 materials that I would go to that I know can translate it. And sometimes I look at these as opportunities to make an experiment, like the piece in Orange County. That's a material that, to my knowledge, not many people have used for sculptural ends. It comes from a different world of design and advertising. So I'm often doing some R&D and seeing what has already happened in architecture or design or other industries where I can use some of those materials and do the same thing I would with found objects in the studio. Find a way to assemble them together and make them work for the ends of for the full installation, to last that time. So
Marilu, then talk to us about then the considerations in placing objects that may be out of non-traditional materials.
So that's the really fun thing, in a way, about actually critiquing the idea of monumentation. So one year at Sculpture Milwaukee, people complained, these works aren't big enough. We couldn't see them. And you think, okay, well, we'll figure that out. I commissioned Carlos Rolón to wrap an entire building with vinyls on the outside. So it was like a 4-story building downtown Milwaukee. And what was interesting about it, he was also critiquing the sort of the growth of international style. It was like another form of colonization with this sort of architectural form that meant one thing in Europe between the wars, but in America it means something very different, the way that was sort of spread around the globe. And also I did a video one year. People just couldn't wrap their heads around that. Also, lighting conditions are difficult to deal with. But one year we had an artwork by Jason Yee. It was PVC pipe that a couple people took apart. The following year, I actually got a spray painted artwork for the sidewalk, actually. But it was a piece that critiqued the idea of shadow culture and how an image like David, Michelangelo's David, haunts artists. And in a way, if you're a sculptor, it's like you always have to pay attention to that. Figurative sculpture, David. I mean, you can't get away from it. You can get around it. How do you critique it? How do you do something very different? People didn't understand the spray paint on the floor either, but it meant nobody damaged it. And that was a really very good discovery as well. So in some ways, when we're dealing with public art, you have to continually experiment and figure out what's the way to solve this problem. How do we support artists? Artists can do anything. They're such smart people. How do you actually find a way to solve these kinds of questions?
Yeah, I'm thinking about that too, because in our work we've found ourselves, in all of the research about monuments that exist, we found ourselves being like, well, monuments have always changed, right? Like even Ball's work, we learned yesterday how that monument has changed over time and how it requires money and mindsets and, knowledge of material to be maintained. And so a lot of times on our team, we're often thinking about the idea that if monuments are always changing, like what does it mean to play around with materials and in meaningful ways? In our citywide exhibition in 2017 in Philadelphia, one of the 20 artists featured, Tanya Bruguera. Her work was meant to deteriorate. It was meant to, over time, have different interactions with the public. You could come back and see it change over time. And it's still having this lasting impact, certainly on all of us, but on a lot of folks who were able to see it and think about the relationship it had to the immigration crisis, which she was reflecting on. And so I think that idea of how will the public interact, how will the weather impact this? I think it's opened the doors for a lot of different ways to use materiality. That's just personally really, really exciting. And also really turns on its head a little bit. Like, what does it mean to be monumental? Is it large? Is it the lasting effect? Is it seeing yourself as powerful in it? It's probably all of those things to a degree, but I think there's a really kind of, exciting intersection of those pieces.
And I want to just say one thing. At the Laumeier Sculpture Park, we had a piece by Ursula von Rüdingsvard, important minimalist artist using nature in her work. And one of the things that was true for her piece is that when you skin a tree and hollow it out, it's not going to last forever. And I think a lot of museums and sculpture parks are having to deal with the fact that you have to build into your contract the fact that the piece may have to be decommissioned at some point. And not deaccessioned, decommissioned, which means this work doesn't represent the artist's intention any longer. We can't, the artist doesn't feel happy about it. We don't have the resources we can't restore it, we can't rebuild it. And so there's a process by which you sort of help it go away. And what I find very radical about that is that the myth that we have in America today about things lasting forever, it's like you're an insurance adjuster, right? You're always safe. You have to really sort of life-proof everything that you do in your world, and that's impossible. And so we have to have that sort of flexibility to understand monuments change, we all change, the world changes. And I think that that's an important thing for us to recognize, that things get torn down, maybe they're put back up, maybe they're not. But the meaning can change.
Yeah, one of my first monumental scale works was done in Harlem, and it was a 20-foot by 40-foot prayer rug, basically, but it was made out of colored sand. So I worked with the team, and basically around 300 hours later, we had poured and sifted by hand or by tools colored sand to create this very intricate prayer rug on the floor. And during the opening of the exhibition, people were standing around it and walking around it and so on. And at some point, a friend of mine's daughter somehow got afraid of something and, wanted to run to her mom and literally ran across the entire piece. And, she was so light and so fast that she just did a couple of little smudges. And the entire place, there was like a collective gasp because people were freaking out. I'd already taken pictures, so I was fine. But, prior to that, I'd lived in Japan for 3 years, and I had, done a lot of hanging out with some monks and watching the sand mandalas being made. So I wanted to bring that experience there. But the funny thing about it is at the end of that exhibition, the whole thing was swept up, and we, dispersed into a body of water. But people still talk about that project, which was like 2001 or 2002. And I find that the memory is more important and probably lasts longer, obviously, than the sand on the ground. And every time people recall the story, it gets better and better. So, so there's lots of ways for these pieces to last even beyond their physicality.
You walked right into my next question. Thank you. My background is art history, material culture, so I think about people's relationship with objects and things. And it's difficult for me, in the beginning, it was difficult for me to talk about an object without having it in my hand. But when I started to connect with objects that were nostalgic for me, that had some history with me in my past, I could go on, like I normally do about everything, for hours about something that I probably hadn't seen or touched in 20 years. So talk to me about that idea of, is it the monument, is it the object, or is it the story? Because your stories about your barber chair are so intimate and so powerful that whether or not I've seen the work, and I have, I still have that sense memory of what that's like, because I went every Friday with my father to the barber shop, and that's why I learned to listen, and I learned what was grown folks' business and what not to repeat. Yeah. And so that idea of, do you really truly need that object to be permanent for the story to have a long life beyond it? Anybody?
But that's such an interesting question, because before writing, we were all oral culture.
Absolutely.
So there's something interesting about that, and the fact that there've always been monuments to some degree. Ancient peoples were making monuments because they wanted to create a ritual space or mark time, whatever it might be. But I think the fact that memory sometimes is the most valuable thing. It really can be.
Yeah, I think being amidst like monument work, as someone who was previously kind of ambivalent to monuments, has always been interesting to me, in part because I know that my family stories live somewhere else. And, to that point of like the storytelling, the oral histories, the dinner tables, the experiences that kind of continue on is where a lot of that is. So it never is just start and finish with a monument, but the monument is part of that process of telling stories. I think about a project we did in North Philadelphia in 2021 called Staying Power, where that central research question was, what is a staying power in your neighborhood, in a city that's rapidly changing? This is a neighborhood in Philly that is feeling the pressure and weight of rapid gentrification, and so that idea of staying power amidst the pandemic, was really important. And so one of the prototype monuments was featured photos by Deb Willis, particularly focused on women at work. Women owned businesses, whether it was the candy shop where a lot of folks learned how to count, or the dress shop, where folks got their Sweet 16 dresses. Those stories, even in image, spoke volumes. And I brought my mother to the opening, and she was like, I know, like, my mom's new to Philly, and she was like, I know these women, like, I have, she related to that in her way. And so I think that transcended, and even being able to document it and have those images live on, even at a large scale, constructed on scaffolding, in a community park, it was really powerful to kind of continue the ways that our stories are shared. So I really think that the monument is part of that storytelling, but we have to know that our stories exist outside of these figures and statues as well.
And growing up as a young person in London, my parents came from Jamaica. So I was born in London. So my other siblings, they were all born in Jamaica. So all I had was their stories and memories. And then all I had was my imagination to make these things up. And there were some practices that they brought to London. So for example, the hot comb. And I know you're doing this.
I have a scar right here.
Right. So I'm a 6-year-old kid. I'm walking downstairs and I'm like, what's that smell? Mm-hmm. So I look and there's my 2 sisters, one sitting on a chair, and the other one, I see the gas stove on, and there's this red hot object on the gas stove. And I see her picking it up. I'm like, oh my goodness gracious. And she puts it in her hair. Mm-hmm. And I see all this steam. And that was the smell. So, there are certain objects, there are certain smells, there are certain stories that I had no visual reference other than what my parents would tell me. And then they would tell me about what it was like coming into the UK, going into these rental properties in Notting Hill Gate. And it was only by the grace of the Jewish landlord Rachman that they were able to rent properties. But they said they would see a sign, no Irish, no dogs, no blacks. So there are certain reference points that are inculcated in my memory that will somehow find their way out in the world in some kind of solid state, some kind of form, to help me navigate, their histories. So in some ways, my entire practice is giving their ideas form, or giving their early thoughts form, giving their stories form. So I think storytelling is really important.
I thought you had. No, I thought I was looking at you because you looked like you had something to say.
Well, I mean, I think I'm still figuring out my relationship between permanence and impermanence when thinking about projects. I already mentioned the piece with the sand, so that was obviously, ephemeral. I grew up doing graffiti in Los Angeles, and anytime you put a piece up, you knew somebody could come right around and just deface it. I've worked with antique quilts, and I'm painting directly on them, which some people consider defacement and other people consider embellishment. But the fact of the matter is a lot of these are being thrown out. So they would have been gone unless they became part of this, artistic intervention. And then cycle through all those materials all the way to working in marble and working in bronze, which are supposedly, permanent works. And I think all of that for me is just sort of like a long experiment to figure out what does leave an impact and what does that impact mean and how does that shift. I don't think we can predict it all. So that's why I still talk about it in terms of experimentation. Documentation becomes important because at least we know this thing happened, but how does it really reside in people's on a cellular level? The verdict is still out for me, but I am still interested in that dance between permanence and impermanence, and for people to think about that because in essence, it is a metaphor for our life.
Yeah.
And I'm also interested in how you have that dialogue with the public in your work. These are your intimate knowledge, your intimate memories. How do you create a dialogue with the public in the work then?
I mean, I think one of the things that I do, I think I did it here when I first came in 2014, is this thing called Live Salon, where, I have a barber chair, place it in the middle of the museum, and I cut somebody's hair and we have a conversation. And for me, it's one of the most tender, disarming things where some of the most obscure people will come up and they will start talking. And I've done it all over the world. I've done it in probably 4 or 5 continents. And it elicits the same kind of response. It really disarms the really kind of, sterile, snooty art environment because everybody can find a part of themselves in the piece just by sitting, listening, and being present. And I think, that's one way that I think that idea of permanence and impermanence factors into my own work. Because our hair is always growing, it's always moving. And it gives us the trace of our ancestors. And what we learned in COVID, that hair always wins. And people are laughing, but they know.
It's true.
They couldn't color those roots. They couldn't straighten the hair out. They couldn't hide that bald patch. And the hair wins. And there's something beautiful that your ancestors come and visit you at that moment. So I think that notion of lifestyle is a way that I try to keep myself connected and almost in step with the public.
Is there anything that any of you would like to tell us that I haven't asked you yet?
Vote.
Thank you all. Thank you. You've been listening to Meet Me at the Chazen. This episode featured a live panel discussion entitled Monuments Reimagined, Contemporary Artists as Changemakers. Meet Me at the Chazen is a production of the Chazen Museum of Art on the campus of UW-Madison in Madison, Wisconsin. For more information about the museum, its collections, and exhibitions, visit chazen.wisc.edu. I'm your host, Gianofer Fields. Thank you for listening.
'Cause that's the way you do it around here.